Hi, all. I'm just here today to give an overview of running economy, kind of what it is and why it's important. Run economy is another pillar of endurance performance that we kind of haven't talked a whole ton about. So I'm just going to give us a little bit of a definition and talk about some ways to go about thinking about it when working with athletes. Okay, so if we look at our pillars of endurance performance, so we have our athlete architecture model we've talked a lot about. So in that we have our VO2 max, which is our maximal oxygen uptake or our aerobic ceiling. We have our critical power or critical speed, which is sort of our highest sustainable output where our physiology shifts from stable to unstable. We have our durability, sort of our physiological resilience, which is our fatigue resistance, our ability to kind of maintain VO2 max, maintain critical speed over time. And then also we have economy or the efficiency of movement. So bike economy is a thing, but we're going to talk efficiency is a thing, but we're going to be talking about run economy here because there tends to be more variability in that. All right, so if we look at what running economy is, so running economy, it's the energy cost of running at any particular submaximal speed. So we measure that by looking at oxygen consumption or VO2. It's a lab measure, and someone has to go to the lab, get hooked up to a metabolic cart to actually determine what their run economy is specifically. It's often expressed in milliliters of oxygen consumed per kilogram per kilometer or per minute. Doesn't matter if it's standardized by distance or time. It's done by performing a step test. So someone will run at a certain speed for 5-6 minutes or longer, and you'll look at the average VO2 in the final couple minutes of each stage. As the speed is increased, there'll be a little bit of a lag where the VO2 fast component will have to catch up to the energy demands. Once that steady state is reached, then you can take the VO2, figure out what the run economy is at that speed. The speeds have to be kept below critical speed. Otherwise, as we know, the VO2 won't stabilize. The measures won't stabilize in order to be able to get a clear read. Lower numbers are better. So we want to be using less oxygen at any given run speed. It indicates using less energy and being more efficient. So this table here is kind of looking at, two runners who both have a VO2 max of about 70 milliliters per kilogram per minute. One runner is a little bit less efficient. So this runner it taps out between 21 and 21 kilometers per hour at that 70 milliliters per kilogram per minute. The runner 2 here is more efficient. They can get up to 22 kilometers per hour at that same VO2. So, in a maximum like a mile race, runner 2 would be winning because they're more economical. Right, so we look at kind of running economy in the real world. VO2 max is very good at differentiating performance between heterogeneous populations. So if you take someone with VO2 max of 45 versus someone with VO2 max of 65, you can pretty much predict that the person of the VO2 max of 65 is going to win. Performances can differ greatly in athletes of similar VO2 maxes. So if you took, a group of runners with VO2 maxes all between, say, 58 and 62, you would see different performance levels in these athletes. Critical power and critical speed is a component of that. It's a better predictor than VO2 max alone, but it still doesn't explain all of the variation between athletes. So that kind of leaves us with this run economy being the sort of important, often overlooked pillar of performance. So run economy can vary by up to 30% of runners who have a similar VO2 max. It tends to differentiate recreational versus higher level runners, and it tends to differentiate between higher level runners. When you get into the front pack Olympic marathoners, they'll tend to have similar VO2 maxes, but different run economies. You can see improved speed at VO2 max without an increase in VO2 max. So when we do a field measure of VO2 max, we're looking at speed and kind of using how fast an athlete can run at these various distances to estimate what their VO2 max is in milliliters per kilogram per minute. But if someone becomes more economical, they might not have any sort of increase in these central adaptations or these muscular adaptations, but if they have an increase in run economy or an improvement in run economy, you'll see them instead of running 6-minute pace at VO2 max, they might get down to 5:45 pace. So it's just a little kind of thing to think about there. Unlike VO2 max, or to some degree, critical power, critical speed, run economy actually is easier to maintain and improve with age. I'll kind of talk about, how actually just running more improves run economy. But if we look at kind of this is just sort of a fun little thing to look at. If we look at the Nike's Breaking 2 project from a few years back. So back in 1985, there was an exercise physiologist, Dr. Joyner, who modeled this sort of hypothetical ideal marathoner who had a VO2 max of 84 milliliters per kilogram per minute, LT2 or critical speed that occurred at 85% of that VO2 max, and quote unquote excellent running economy, which the number there was 200 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per kilometer. And based on that model, he predicted that a 1:57:58 marathon was possible. At the time, the current world record was 2:06:50, so it was pretty far off. But then, fast forward many years later, and we have our Breaking 2 project. So Nike kind of looked at those numbers, and those athletes that they used for that Breaking 2 project had a lower average VO2 max. It was 75 milliliters per kilogram per minute, but their LT2/critical speed occurred at 92% of their VO2 max, and their economy was much better. Again, remember, lower numbers are better at 191 milliliters per kilogram per kilometer. So, and then eventually, Eliud Kipchoge was able to break 2 hours. Obviously, there was pacing and super shoes in there, but I think he actually had the lowest VO2 max of any of the participants there, but he had the best run economy. He's kind of one of the most economical runners that has ever been on the planet. So he was able to break the 2-hour barrier there. Another kind of real world example was it's another physiologist, Andrew Jones, who followed the career of Paula Radcliffe, the former world marathon record holder, between 1992 and 2003. And what he found was over that time, she showed a 15% improvement in her running economy. There wasn't a huge difference in her VO2 max or her critical speed, but there was a lot of movement in her running economy, which allowed her to run 2:15 and held the world record for many, many years until super shoes came along. So it was really a standout performance at the time. So if we look at what influences running economy, so muscle fiber type does. Athletes who have a greater percentage of sort of the more slow twitch or oxidative type 2A fibers generally tend to have better run economy. They're more fatigue resistant. They're more efficient. Metabolic factors, so having higher mitochondrial density, having higher oxidative enzymes, just things that make us more efficient at using oxygen tend to lead to better run economy. Biomechanics. I think, everyone thinks of run economy and they automatically think there's some perfect run form that's more efficient, more economical. That's not necessarily the case. There's a few things that are associated with better run economy, but nothing that's, by and far and above that's, kind of shown out. This is what you need to do to be economical. So less vertical oscillation is generally more economical, less up and down bounce, more forward motion is more economical. Makes sense. Slightly more forward lean and a lower ground contact time are associated with a better run economy. So again, kind of just quick on and off the ground, keeping the center of gravity moving forward. Foot strike patterns do not appear to impact running economy. So I know, years back, there's a big pose running, all those different, everyone should change to forefoot striking. This is more economical. There's less braking forces. That's not the case. People tend to find what's best for them in terms of foot strike. But what has been found is actually trying to force changing to a forefoot strike actually can decrease run economy. In terms of joint angles, kinematics, how someone's running, if we measure angles on someone, it's likely individual. So kind of that second point in there. Runners tend to self-select their most economical stride length and cadence, and varying either way will increase energy costs. So there are definitely cases where, playing around with run cadence and stride length do make sense if somebody has, obvious overstriding, or if they have, injuries that are associated with kind of impact. It does make sense to kind of play around with cadence in some of those cases, but there will be a cost to run economy initially, and then until somebody adjusts to it. But just kind of keep in mind, trying to force these biomechanical changes isn't necessarily going to be the ticket. People tend to just kind of find their way to their most economical gait. In terms of kind of some stuff can't necessarily change, but anthropometrics and leg structure, Bigger calves and longer lower legs have been seen in more economical runners. So if we look at kind of like the East African runners versus someone more of European descent, they tend to have, longer shins, bigger calves, higher up on the calf or on the shin. And also muscle mass distributed higher on the thighs is associated with better run economy. So don't want a thigh gap necessarily, if you have a lot of, thigh muscle that higher up on the thigh, that tends to help. Muscle tendon stiffness is a big one. So tendon stiffness refers to the ability of tendons to store and then release elastic energy. It's a positive trait. A stiffer tendon is more economical. It has, more elasticity to it. It will give you greater energy return. So better tendon stiffness does lead to better run economy. And actually less flexibility also helps with this, just because there's a little bit more stiffness at lower extremity joints. A longer Achilles tendon is more economical. The Achilles is, one of the most important tendons when it comes to propulsion and when it comes to elastic energy. So having a little bit more length, but a stiff but longer Achilles tendon does tend to lead to better run economy. And then footwear, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but lighter shoes are more economical. Shaving a couple ounces will shave some oxygen cost off of running, especially because it's at the base of the lever arm when you're running. And super shoes are more economical. Again, I'll get more into that in a bit. So running economy, again, kind of talked about how it's not a look. It's not something you can look at somebody and, say they're economical versus not. I put a picture of Lionel Sanders up here because I think he's, kind of the famous person in the triathlon world where you look at him and you're like, how the heck is he running so fast? But he is, it's his run gait works for him. So there was a study where 121 trained coaches from high school to professional coaches were shown 5 runners on video and asked to rank them from 1 through 5. Nobody got it correct. So it's not something that even somebody who thinks they're trained can look at and see from the naked eye. Another important thing to consider is run economy durability. So I talked a little bit about, how durability is one of the pillars of endurance performance, that in terms of looking at, the definition of durability is just the ability to maintain these kind of markers of performance over time. So the ability to maintain VO2 max over time, the ability to maintain critical speed over time, and also the ability to maintain running economy over time. So we know our running speed at our thresholds does decrease over time, and this is a big differentiator in endurance performance, particularly over 1.5 to 2 hours. So it's why 2 people with the same 5K time aren't going to necessarily run the same marathon time. Deterioration of run economy is a factor in this deterioration of speed. So decrements in run economy have been seen to range from about 0 to 10% after an hour of running, and then anywhere from 5 to 16% at the end of a marathon. So higher performing runners, are able to better maintain their run economy than lower performing runners in general. So this happens, as muscles fatigue, we have to increase muscle fiber recruitment. We kind of start recruiting more of these type 2 fibers that use more energy. This increases our oxygen demand. So if we look at kind of what happens with fatigue, if our VO2 max and our critical power, critical speed are decreasing, while the energy cost of running is increasing, the body is recruiting more muscle mass, this can kind of push us over these sort of boundaries into unintended intensity domains. So what you might see is, if somebody's running near their critical speed, and they're fatigued, their critical speed is lower after a certain amount of running, well, their energy demand is higher, so you might kind of accidentally trip them over their critical speed, at that point in time, even if when it's measured in a fresh state, it's lower. So, somebody who can run 7-minute miles fresh, might not be able to run 7:30s when fatigued. Something to think about. So what we kind of see too with fatigue is that there tends to be decreased work at the ankle joint, while there's increased work at the hip and knee. So this is, again, more pronounced in recreational runners versus competitive runners. So what it means is just, as I said, the Achilles tendon gives us all this elastic energy, all this kind of free speed, free energy when running. So if we're using less work at our ankle joint, shifting it more up to the hip and knee where we have bigger muscles, less elastic energy, that's going to, again, up our oxygen cost and decrease our run efficiency. All right, so some considerations for triathlon. So obviously, triathlon, we're never running fresh. We're always starting races in a fatigue state onto the run. So this can increase the energy cost of running anywhere from about 1 to 12%. I think that study was done in Olympic athletes. It might be more, longer course athletes. Again, it's a differentiator between more elite athletes and less experienced athletes, as more elite athletes maintain run economy better off the bike. Some potential contributors, there's a decrease in stride length. You might see changes in kind of biomechanics or motor pattern changes, resulting in increased muscle recruitment or use of different muscles that results in greater oxygen use. So I had many injuries over the year that kind of made me start developing this sort of like backward lean and hitch off the bike, and obviously I've lost some run economy that way. There's also tends to be sort of increased ventilation and an increased breathing frequency after biking. Okay, so that's all fine and well, but kind of practically, how do we look at run economy when we don't have a lab? It's nice if athletes can go and get hooked up to a metabolic cart and get measurements, but practically there's very, very few people that are going to be able to do that. So a few things I was just thinking of these ideas of ways we could think about it. One thing to look at, especially when it comes to run economy durability, is heart rate to pace decoupling. So if we have somebody that's running at a submaximal speed, running well below their critical speed, and you're seeing their heart rate rise a lot across the course of the run, kind of more than you would expect, especially in temperate conditions. I mean, obviously we expect to see a little bit more decoupling in the heat. That might not be a valid measure, but if it's a cool day and somebody's holding the same pace and you're seeing these huge increases in their heart rate, that indicates that they're using more oxygen. It might indicate that their run economy is falling apart a little bit. So that is something to think about. And then another thing I was sort of thinking about is kind of looking at, we're triathletes, we can kind of look at where bike performance in particular, because swim is so technique driven, and run performance are falling relative to each other. So if somebody is, really relatively strong on the bike and, doesn't seem like their run is adding up, even though they've been training plenty, that might indicate, they're just not super economical on the run. So I found this is a Sebastian Sicko study where he came up with this formula to estimate your bike VO2 max based on your 5-minute power. So relative power output in watts per kg. So I just kind of, ran the calculation on myself. Approximately, that was technically my 6-minute power from a few days ago, but came out to about 53 milliliters per kilogram per minute for my bike VO2 max. And then I was kind of looking at, Jack Daniels, again, many, many years ago, came up with these VDOT tables, which again took, our VO2 max and kind of gave an estimation of what you should technically be able to run at that VO2 max, assuming, good run economy and all that. So if we look at, kind of this 53 line, I'm not there right now at the moment. So that might indicate, my run economy could use some work. Another thing is to consider bike versus run durability. So if somebody is, can hit, tempo intervals and, maintain performance deep into a bike, but they can't do the same on the run, that might indicate that their economy is, again, falling apart a little bit more on the run. I think, my bias has always been if somebody's run isn't up to par on their bike, it means they probably need to bike more. So they're getting off the bike less fatigued and it's taking less out of them, when in reality, it might be that there's a run economy deficit that actually, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but, it might be better worked on by actually running more or adding in some strength training. Okay, so if we look at our ways to improve run economy, kind of the easiest, simplest way is super shoes. So our super shoes are, obviously everywhere these days. There are more responsive, these kind of lighter super foams. Each brand has their own different, composite of these foams that give us this higher energy return, added with a carbon plate for some stability and, to give it some sort of something to work off of. When you see 4% improvement and 2% improvement, 6% improvement. This is based on run economy measures. So these lab taken run economy measures. In reality, a 4% improvement in run economy won't necessarily be a 4% improvement in performance. Usually the performance improvement is a little bit less than the run economy improvement, but we measure it by looking at run economy improvements. So different run forms, different foot shapes, different foot strikes, they'll all interact with different makes and models of super shoes in different ways. There's individual variations. So, you can't say this one shoe is that's best for someone, is best for someone else. I think, I've probably tried every super shoe on the market in hopes of finding my past run speed to no avail. But, it's just, might be a little bit of a measure of trial and error, expensive trial and error of figuring out what seems to work best for you. Generally, the percent improvements in run economy are greater at greater speeds. This isn't the case for everyone. It's not the case for every study, but this generally has been the trend that we've seen. There's one study that found there's about a 3 to 4% improvement in run economy at around a 6 to 7 minute mile pace. And then about an 8 to 10 minute mile pace is decreased to 1 to 1.5%. Again, there's a lot of individual variation in this, but the foams that work like springs, so usually, faster running when you're hitting with more force will give you greater energy return from the shoe. In terms of run economy durability, super shoes, they may not prevent decrements in run economy over time, over like 80 to 90 minutes. Again, this depends on the study you look at, but they do maintain their benefits over normal shoes. So even, at hour 3 of the marathon in a super shoe, you'll still be more economical than you would be in a normal shoe, even if it's not as much of a benefit as it was, 30 minutes to an hour into the run. In terms of kind of ways that you have to actually work at, so physiological improvements, just basically running more. Like I said before, people tend to find their most economical run form just by running themselves. So regular long runs and higher weekly run volumes have resulted in better run economy durability in performance matched runners. So the regular long runs were defined as, I think, greater than 90 minutes. Runners who incorporated them showed better run economy over time than athletes who were, running, I think it was 75 minutes or less on a regular basis. So, especially for like longer distance running, marathons, getting in the long runs is important. Again, as we said, kind of that Paula Radcliffe longitudinal study, run economy can improve up to 15% just with long-term physiological development. You tend to see, just with running more, you get these neuromuscular benefits, you get better motor coordination and recruitment. It's just kind of like, practicing an instrument where you get that muscle memory over time by doing something repeatedly again and again and again to the point where it just becomes automatic. Another way to improve run economy that we can work at is through strength and plyometric training. So this will improve our muscle power development and it will improve our elastic energy efficiency. So basically, when we have these stronger muscle fibers, we don't need to recruit as many of them to produce the same amount of force, which makes us uses less oxygen, makes us more economical. And strength training and heavy strength training and plyometrics will improve tendon stiffness, which will give us more elastic energy. So that's more that kind of free speed. So this can show, improved run economy anywhere from 2 to 8%, even in the shorter term. I think it was like 12 weeks with that. Heavy strength and plyometrics twice a week have also been shown to improve run economy after 90 minutes of running in the heavy domain. So this would be kind of like RZ2 or, kind of like a marathon to half marathon pace. And it also improves subsequent time to exhaustion at 95% VO2 max. So basically, putting this heavy strength and plyometric training in a couple times a week is important to improve performance over these kind of longer haul races. And this has been shown to help with triathletes too with heavy strength training. So I kind of put in, just a little bit of details of the strength training program they used with triathletes at the bottom. They're progressing from moderate, repetitions, moderate weights to heavier loads. The key for improving run economy, kind of what we found, is that it does need to work up to these heavy loads, or it does need to include this kind of plyometric, stretch shortening cycle, kind of explosive based training. It needs to include one or the other of those to improve run economy. Generally speaking, doing like low weight, higher rep doesn't have the same impact as doing either heavy strength or plyometrics. Couple other things, so I put kind of zone out, Netflix, and run. Don't overthink. So what's been shown is that running economy is actually better when running with an external focus. So this is things like watching a video, kind of looking around at your surroundings. versus when there's, this heavy internal focus on what's your form doing, or what's your breathing doing, or how hard am I working in any given second, which isn't to say it's not important to check in with those things every now and then. I mean, like I said before, I know I have my tendency to lean back, so it's something I just kind of check in with here and there. But if you're kind of running and thinking about how am I firing this muscle, or am I contracting my glutes, I hear that all the time, or am I tightening my core, this and that, that's usually backfires. It usually just makes you less economical. Like I said before, people tend to self-select their most economical running form. So if you start just overthinking what you're doing, tends to not be economical. Running is one of the most natural things we do. So, don't overthink when you're out there. One other kind of interesting thing I found was that a good supportive sports bra actually does, or sports bro, I suppose, does actually help run economy. So in conclusion here, our running economy is the energy cost of running at any given maximal speed. Again, we measure that by looking at oxygen consumption. That's our proxy for how much energy we're using. It's a differentiator in performance between athletes who may otherwise be physiologically similar, who might have, similar VO2 max values, who might have kind of similar fractional utilization or critical speed values. It's not something that necessarily can be visualized by the naked eye. We can't tell how economical a person is or isn't just by looking at them. It's something to consider when run performance isn't adding up. So, when somebody's, bike performance doesn't have a strong bike background, might be outweighing their run performance, or, when you're seeing these differences in, bike durability versus run durability, it's definitely something to consider there, and, kind of consider adding in some things that will improve run economy, such as increasing run volume. This can be easy run volume, or, in a less durable athlete, in terms of injury wise, you might want to add in some strength training as well. So those are the kind of things you would want to incorporate just to get a little bit more automatic of improvements in run economy versus overthinking gait changes or trying to force biomechanics or anything like that. All right, so hopefully this was helpful. Gave a good overview of run economy for you. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Got a few slides of references here that probably no one's going to go through. But all right, thanks for tuning in, and thanks so much.